In the heart of Tudor England, a storm was brewing not on the battlefield but within the royal court. It was a rivalry that would shake a kingdom, divide a king, and change the course of history forever. Two powerful women, Katherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, stood on opposite sides of a personal and political war that sparked a national religious upheaval and left an enduring legacy. This wasn't just a love triangle, it was a clash of queens, beliefs, ambition, and survival. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video we'll dive deep into the riveting story of the rivalry between Katherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, how their struggle for the crown ignited the English Reformation, reshaped the monarchy, and gave rise to two of history's most iconic queens, Mary I and Elizabeth I. Get ready for betrayal, power plays, and a tale where every choice carried the weight of a kingdom. In the vast and turbulent landscape of Tudor history, few rivalries have captured the imagination, political interest, and emotional resonance of historians and readers alike as much as the conflict between Katherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Their confrontation was not simply a personal feud between two women vying for the affection and recognition of the same man, King Henry VIII. It was a deeply political and religious clash that marked a decisive turning point in English history. This work sets out to explore that rivalry in both its human and historical dimensions, examining not just the women themselves, but also the vast web of events, beliefs, and consequences that surrounded them. Their conflict was as much about the nature of power, legitimacy, and faith as it was about emotion and pride. Katherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn were two women of extraordinary intelligence, influence, and strength, but they came from starkly different backgrounds and embodied contrasting ideals of queenship. Katherine, born a Spanish princess, was the daughter of the powerful Catholic monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. She arrived in England not merely as a consort but as a symbol of a crucial European alliance, imbued with religious devotion, political wisdom, and a strong sense of her own royal identity. She married Henry VIII after the death of her first husband, his elder brother Arthur, and spent over 2 decades as Queen of England. During that time she earned deep respect from the English people, played significant roles in governance, and fiercely championed her right as both wife and queen when her position was threatened. Anne Boleyn, on the other hand, emerged not from royal lineage but from a well-connected noble family with increasing aspirations. She was educated in the courts of the Netherlands and France, where she was exposed to Renaissance humanism and the early winds of religious reform. Upon returning to England, she became a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, where her wit, charm, and refusal to become Henry's mistress set her apart from other women at court. Her relationship with the king gradually evolved into an obsession on his part, and eventually, a political crusade that would reshape the monarchy and the church. Anne's rise was meteoric and unprecedented. From courtier to Queen of England, she broke centuries of precedent not only in unseating a reigning queen but in provoking a complete schism between England and the Roman Catholic Church. The backdrop to their conflict was a time of immense transition and tension in England. The early 16th century was marked by religious uncertainty, dynastic anxiety, and the consolidation of monarchical power. Henry VIII's desire for a male heir, believing this was necessary for dynastic stability, clashed with the reality of his aging wife's inability to produce a surviving son. Catherine, despite multiple pregnancies, bore only one surviving child, Mary. Henry's desperation for a male heir and his growing infatuation with and led him to seek an annulment of his marriage to Catherine, a process that would stretch over 7 years and come to be known as the King's Great Matter. Catherine, however, refused to step aside. She insisted she was the rightful queen, and her marriage had been legitimated in the eyes of both God and man. Her steadfast refusal to concede turned what might have been a private royal affair into an international crisis. Anne's role in the dissolution crisis was equally transformative. She was not a passive object of Henry's desire, rather she was a shrewd and active participant in shaping his resolve. Her influence over Henry and her support for reformist religious ideas dovetailed with a growing movement in England that questioned papal authority. Anne supported the spread of vernacular Bibles, showed favor to Protestant thinkers, and was associated with intellectuals like Thomas Cranmer. The religious and political consequences of her ascendancy were enormous. To marry Anne, Henry had to reject the Pope's authority, declare himself supreme head of the Church of England, and initiate the English Reformation, a seismic event that permanently changed the nation's religious structure and international alliances. The rivalry between Catherine and Anne thus unfolded on multiple levels. Personally, it was a deeply painful, intimate struggle between two proud, determined women, each believing in the legitimacy of her cause, each convinced of her right to the crown. Politically, it was a battleground for factions within the court, aligning themselves with either the old Catholic world or the emerging Protestant order. Religiously, it symbolized the growing chasm between traditional Catholicism and the early stirrings of Protestant reform in England. Their conflict mobilized the pens of theologians, the swords of diplomats, and the loyalties of the English people, many of whom remained attached to Catherine as the true queen even after her removal. The outcome of their rivalry had implications that extended far beyond their own lifetimes. Catherine's daughter Mary would eventually become queen and attempt to restore Catholicism, earning her the nickname Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants. Anne's daughter Elizabeth would rise to the throne and become one of the most celebrated monarchs in English history, firmly establishing Protestantism and ruling with a legacy that overshadowed both her parents. In this way, the rivalry between their mothers was not just a matter of dynastic succession, it was a contest over the religious, cultural, and political identity of the nation. This video aims to unravel the many strands of this complex rivalry: personal devotion and betrayal, maternal legacy, religious conviction, and political ambition. It does not seek to cast one woman as a heroine and the other as a villain, for both Catherine and Anne have been simplified too often in popular depictions. Instead, it seeks to restore their depth, agency, and significance, portraying them not just as rivals, but as individuals whose choices, convictions, and courage altered the fate of England. Their story is one of tragedy and transformation, loss and legacy, and at its heart, a powerful testament to the enduring impact of two formidable women caught in the center of a revolution. Katherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn were two women who could not have appeared more different at first glance, yet they would come to play central roles in one of the most consequential dramas of Tudor England. To understand the roots of their rivalry, one must begin with their origins, the families, educations, and cultural context that shaped them into the women who would eventually become the first two wives of King Henry VIII. Their backgrounds, while equally rich in influence and expectation, laid the foundations for radically contrasting worldviews, ambitions, and approaches to queenship. Katherine of Aragon was born in 1485 into the most powerful royal house in Spain. Her parents, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, were the Catholic monarchs famous not only for uniting their kingdoms and creating a centralized Spain, but also for their militant defense of Catholic orthodoxy. Catherine was their youngest child, and from the beginning she was groomed not merely as a princess, but as a dynastic tool for forging critical alliances across Europe. Her marriage to Prince Arthur of England, the eldest son of Henry VII, was negotiated as part of a grand political strategy to align England and Spain against France. Even as a child, Catherine would have been keenly aware of her role in international diplomacy. This awareness would only grow as she matured, steeped in an environment where piety, political calculation, and dynastic duty were all inseparably linked. Her education reflected her status as a royal daughter in the most prestigious Catholic court of the time. Under the guidance of her mother, Catherine was taught Latin, history, philosophy, law, and most importantly, theology. Her tutors were among the most learned clerics in Spain, and from an early age she developed an intense personal devotion to the Catholic faith. She was known to fast frequently, attend Mass daily, and read religious texts in both Latin and Spanish. Her faith was not only a private comfort but also a cornerstone of her political identity. Isabella raised her daughters to believe that queens must be spiritually and morally exemplary, defenders of the true faith in both word and action. Catherine internalized this ideal deeply. It would later serve as both a source of strength and suffering as her marriage and queenship came under attack. In 1501, at the age of 15, Catherine traveled to England to marry Arthur. Their union was short-lived. Arthur died just a few months after the wedding, leaving Catherine a widow in a foreign country. Her subsequent years were fraught with uncertainty as she waited for a resolution to her future. She claimed her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, a key point that would later be central in the debate over her marriage to Henry VIII. Eventually, in 1509, she married Henry, now king, and became Queen of England. Her early years as queen were marked by popularity and productivity. She was intelligent, composed, deeply religious, and bore herself with regal dignity. She saw herself as both a political agent and a spiritual mother to the English people. Her role model was her mother Isabella, a queen who led armies, administered justice, and ruled alongside her husband with authority and grace. In striking contrast, Anne Boleyn's origins were more modest, though no less influential in shaping her ambitions. Born around 1501, Anne was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a rising courtier, and Elizabeth Howard, who came from one of England's oldest noble families. The Boleyns were ambitious, and through strategic marriages and royal service, they steadily advanced their standing at court. Anne's early life was spent not in England but in the more refined courts of the continent. Around the age of 12, she was sent to the Netherlands to be educated under Margaret of Austria, one of the most respected female rulers in Europe. This was an extraordinary opportunity for an English girl, reflecting both her family's aspirations and her early promise. After her time in the Netherlands and moved to the French court, where she served Queen Claude. There she was exposed to the artistic, intellectual and cultural innovations of the French Renaissance. She learned to speak fluent French, developed impeccable taste in fashion and literature, and absorbed the sophisticated manners of the court. Unlike Catherine's education, which was deeply theological and framed around queenship through piety, Anne's education emphasized courtly behavior, charm, rhetoric, and wit. She learned how to move through the world of royalty not as a submissive wife or vessel for heirs, but as a dynamic and compelling participant in politics, culture, and intrigue. By the time she returned to England in the 1520s, Anne had become an elegant and intelligent young woman with a sharp mind and an assertive personality. She soon became a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, and her presence at court quickly drew attention. She was not conventionally beautiful by the standards of the time, described as having dark hair, an olive complexion, and striking eyes, but she possessed a rare charisma. Unlike her sister Mary Boleyn, who had been Henry VIII's mistress and faded into relative obscurity, and refused to submit to the role of a mere lover. She set her sights higher. If Catherine embodied the traditional ideal of a queen, patient, noble, and devout, and represented a new model, clever, ambitious, and fiercely independent. The early contrast between Catherine and Anne lay not only in their origins but also in the ways their experiences shaped their identities. Catherine, rooted in the martial and religious traditions of Spain, saw her role as one of sacred responsibility. Her queenship was grounded in her status as a wife and mother, her devotion to the church, and her sense of divine duty. Anne, by contrast, was forged in the intellectual salons of Europe, where courtly love, personal advancement, and religious reform were common topics. She was not content to exist within the boundaries traditionally prescribed for women. Her ambitions were not masked by humility, they were part of her allure. Religion, too, would play a significant role in defining the divergence between the two women. Catherine remained steadfastly Catholic, believing in the authority of the Pope, the sacraments, and the teachings of the Church with an almost mystical devotion. And, while not a Protestant in the later, fully developed sense, was strongly sympathetic to the ideas of reform. She supported the reading of the Bible in English, was influenced by humanist thinkers such as Erasmus and William Tyndale, and aligned herself with those who sought a less corrupt and more personal form of religious experience. She would later use her influence to place reformist thinkers in positions of power, and her personal library contained many texts considered heretical by traditional Catholic standards. The two women also had profoundly different views on femininity and queenship. Catherine believed that a queen's greatest virtues were chastity, obedience, piety, and sacrifice. She lived those values to the letter, even at great personal cost. And, on the other hand, saw queenship as a platform for power, influence, and reform. She was willing to challenge norms, speak her mind, and stand up to powerful men. To many contemporaries, this made her dangerously bold. To others, it made her modern. Yet for all their differences, both women were intelligent, strategic, and fiercely committed to their ideals. Catherine would endure humiliation, exile, and separation from her child rather than deny the sanctity of her marriage, and would risk scandal, defy the church, and ultimately face execution in pursuit of her vision. The seeds of their eventual rivalry were not planted in mere jealousy or personal resentment, but in the deeply embedded contrasts of upbringing, education, and belief. Catherine and Anne each embodied a different conception of what it meant to be a queen, a woman, and a servant of God, and in Tudor England, such differences could not peacefully coexist. Their origins did not simply shape their personalities, they prepared them for a collision course that would shake the very foundations of the English throne. Catherine of Aragon's reign as Queen of England began in 1509, shortly after the death of her father-in-law, Henry VII. Her marriage to Henry VIII, who had recently ascended the throne at just 17 years old, was not only the fulfillment of a long-delayed union but the realization of a vital political alliance. This match was rooted in decades of careful dynastic planning between England and Spain, the latter emerging as a major Catholic power under the rule of Catherine's formidable parents, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. England, still recovering from the instability of the Wars of the Roses, benefited immensely from such an alliance. Spain offered legitimacy, wealth, and international credibility. For Spain, England provided a counterbalance to French ambitions. The marriage was a diplomatic triumph and a personal second chance for Catherine, who had spent several years in limbo after the death of her first husband, Arthur, Henry's older brother. Despite the political calculations behind their union, the early years of Catherine and Henry's marriage were marked by genuine affection and mutual respect. Henry, young, handsome, and energetic, found in Catherine not only a partner of royal pedigree but one of intellect, virtue, and grace. She was several years older than him, but her dignity, fluency in Latin, and understanding of diplomacy impressed both court and clergy. Henry often praised her publicly, calling her his most beloved wife. Together they projected an image of a strong, stable monarchy, he a chivalric prince, she a serene and noble queen. Their court became known for its splendor and pageantry, and under Catherine's influence, it embraced elements of Spanish refinement and strict Catholic morality. The Queen's presence lent an air of piety and sophistication that many English courtiers admired. Catherine took her role as queen consort seriously and approached it with a sense of duty instilled in her since childhood. As daughter of Isabella, one herself a monarch in her own right, Catherine understood queenship not merely as ceremonial but as active participation in governance. Her education had prepared her to be more than a royal ornament. She was a queen educated in law, theology, and history, and she brought this knowledge to bear on her responsibilities. She became deeply involved in matters of charity, church patronage, and moral reform. Catherine supported scholars, promoted the arts, and maintained a rigorous religious practice that earned her the respect of the English clergy. Her popularity with the English people was genuine and widespread. She was often seen as a queen of the people, gracious, charitable, and deeply concerned with the welfare of the poor. She regularly distributed alms, funded hospitals, and supported religious institutions. Her acts of kindness and her adherence to Catholic orthodoxy made her a spiritual as well as a political figurehead. Even in times of growing political tension, Catherine maintained the support of many of her subjects, especially women, who admired her strength and faith in the face of personal suffering. One of the most remarkable demonstrations of Catherine's capabilities as queen came in 1513 when Henry left for a military campaign in France. During his absence, Catherine was appointed regent and tasked with the governance of the kingdom. It was during this time that England faced a threat from the Scots, who sought to take advantage of Henry's absence. Catherine not only oversaw the defense of the realm but also coordinated military preparations. When the Scots invaded, English forces met them at the Battle of Flodden. Catherine's leadership, both symbolic and administrative, was central to the English victory. She famously sent Henry a piece of the bloodied coat of the slain Scottish king, James IV, as a trophy. This moment elevated her reputation and demonstrated that she could rise to the demands of sovereignty, not just in courtly performance but in matters of war and governance. Catherine's devotion to Catholicism was perhaps the most defining aspect of her personal and political identity. She believed that her role as queen was divinely sanctioned and that her marriage was a holy sacrament not to be broken. Her faith shaped her moral compass, her commitment to charity, and her resistance to the annulment proceedings that would later define the last years of her queenship. She prayed constantly, kept regular fasts, and wore a hair shirt beneath her royal garments as a sign of humility and self-punishment. Her piety earned her the admiration of the English clergy and the broader Catholic world. Even Erasmus, the great humanist thinker, praised her as an ideal Christian queen. Despite her successes as queen, Catherine's reign was overshadowed by a singular, devastating failure: her inability to provide Henry with a living male heir. This would prove not only a personal tragedy but the catalyst for England's greatest political and religious upheaval. From early in their marriage, Catherine became pregnant multiple times. Her first pregnancy resulted in a stillborn daughter. The next pregnancy, in 1511, brought the birth of a son, Prince Henry, who lived for only 52 days. The entire court had celebrated his birth with immense joy, but his sudden death crushed hopes for dynastic stability. Over the next decade, Catherine experienced several more pregnancies, most ending in miscarriage or stillbirth. The only surviving child from these repeated attempts was Princess Mary, born in 1516. The emotional toll of these repeated losses was immense. Catherine suffered in silence, retreating more deeply into her faith, which she believed would sustain her and eventually reward her devotion. She interpreted her misfortunes not as punishment but as tests of her spiritual strength. Publicly she remained composed, but in private she was devastated. Each failed pregnancy brought renewed tension and desperation. Henry, once tender and admiring, grew increasingly frustrated. The Tudor dynasty, still relatively new and uncertain, depended on the birth of a male heir to prevent the sort of civil wars that had plagued England in the previous century. Henry's fears of instability and the weakening of his lineage began to consume him, and he interpreted Catherine's barrenness as a divine sign that their marriage was cursed. By the 1520s, the pressures of succession had become acute. Henry had reached his 30s with no surviving son, and Catherine, nearing menopause, could no longer be expected to produce an heir. This created a dangerous void at the heart of the monarchy. Henry's desperation for a male heir would eventually lead him to seek the annulment of his marriage, a decision that Catherine resisted with every fiber of her being. Her refusal was not rooted in personal pride alone, but in religious conviction and dynastic principle. She maintained that her marriage to Henry was valid in the eyes of God, and she would not concede to a legal fiction that would render her daughter illegitimate. Catherine's steadfastness during this crisis was remarkable. She refused to be cast aside quietly. She spoke eloquently in court, appealing directly to Henry's conscience and the legal precedents of Christendom. She garnered international support, particularly from her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and she remained popular among the English people, many of whom viewed her as the true queen even after she was officially stripped of the title. Her sense of dignity and moral clarity stood in stark contrast to the increasingly erratic and self-serving behavior of her husband. Catherine's queenship, therefore, was both a triumph and a tragedy. She began her reign as a beloved and competent queen consort, whose intelligence, piety, and strength were assets to the English crown. She acted with grace and authority, proved capable in political crises, and left an indelible mark on the court and church. Yet her reign was ultimately undone by forces beyond her control, chiefly her inability to produce a male heir in a patriarchal society that equated legitimacy with masculinity. Her childbearing failures, though not uncommon for the time, became political liabilities in a monarchy desperate for a secure succession. Even in her decline, Catherine retained the dignity of a queen. She never accepted the annulment of her marriage, never acknowledged Anne Boleyn as queen, and never stopped praying for the soul of the man who had discarded her. Her story is one of resilience, duty, and unyielding faith. In many ways, Katherine of Aragon embodied the medieval ideal of a Christian queen, pious, loyal, and steadfast, but found herself caught in the early modern storm of dynastic crisis, religious reform, and the whims of an increasingly autocratic monarch. Her reign, while marked by great personal suffering, set a standard for queenship that would resonate for generations. Anne Boleyn's rise at the Tudor court was both meteoric and unprecedented, shaped by her intelligence, poise, ambition, and timing. Her emergence from the background of courtly life to become the focal point of Henry VIII's world was not merely a personal triumph but a turning point in English history. The roots of Anne's influence began when she returned to England after several formative years spent on the continent, bringing with her a refinement and sophistication that stood out even in the glittering atmosphere of the royal court. Upon her return, Anne took up service as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Katherine of Aragon. Her sister Mary had previously served in this same role and had been a mistress to Henry VIII, a fact that would cast a shadow over the Boleyn family's reputation. But Anne was of a different mold. She had absorbed the elegance and intellect of the French court, where she had served Queen Claude, and she brought with her a worldly sensibility uncommon among English noblewomen. She was fluent in French, well-read, and skilled in music, dance, and conversation. Her fashion sense was bold and modern, setting trends rather than following them. More than her appearance, it was Anne's wit and self-assurance that made her captivating. In a court that valued pageantry and display, and had the rare ability to command attention without seeming to seek it, she stood apart from the more demure and traditionally submissive women of Catherine's household. Where Catherine embodied the virtues of obedience and humility, and was playful, clever, and strategically elusive, she quickly gained admirers among courtiers, and her presence began to draw the notice of the king. Though Anne was not conventionally beautiful by the standards of the time, her dark eyes, expressive face, and commanding presence made her irresistible to many, including Henry VIII. She knew how to navigate courtly love traditions, employing flirtation with purpose, never giving too much while maintaining the mystery of unattainability. Henry's interest in and developed gradually but intensified rapidly. Their early interactions followed the standard script of courtly flirtation dances, masked balls, witty exchanges, but Anne soon realized the king's intentions were serious. Unlike her sister Mary, Anne refused to become his mistress. Whether out of personal conviction, religious values, or strategic foresight, she made a conscious decision to withhold herself from the king's advances unless they came with the promise of marriage. This refusal only inflamed Henry's desire. Accustomed to being indulged, the king found Anne's resistance both maddening and intoxicating. What began as infatuation evolved into a deep obsession. Anne's refusal to yield easily was calculated. She knew that the stakes were high, and she used her position not simply to secure favor but to change her destiny. By denying Henry physical intimacy, she effectively controlled the narrative of their relationship. He wrote her letters, many of which survive today, that reveal a man besotted, even desperate. In these letters, Henry pledges loyalty, praises her beauty and virtue, and pleads for signs of affection. Anne answered with enough warmth to maintain his passion, but not enough to surrender her strategic position. She maneuvered herself into the role of indispensable companion and confidant, someone who engaged Henry intellectually as well as emotionally. It was during this period of courtship that Anne's influence on Henry began to extend beyond romance. She surrounded herself with reformist thinkers and texts, aligning herself with the currents of religious change sweeping through Europe. The Protestant Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther in 1517, was challenging the authority of the Catholic Church. While Anne was never an open follower of Lutheranism, she sympathized with calls for reform and promoted access to scripture in English. She owned banned books such as William Tyndale's English New Testament, and encouraged Henry to read them. And was not content to be merely the king's love interest, she sought to shape his thinking and the future of the kingdom. At the time, England was still staunchly Catholic, but dissatisfaction with the church was growing. Corruption among the clergy, the selling of indulgences, and papal interference in national matters all fed resentment. Anne's conversations with Henry began to reflect this sentiment. She questioned why Englishmen should send money to Rome, why kings should bow to papal authority, and why scripture should not be accessible to all believers. These ideas, though radical for their time, found fertile ground in Henry's mind, especially as his desire to marry and ran headlong into the Pope's refusal to annul his marriage to Catherine. Henry had initially sought an annulment on the grounds that his marriage to Catherine had been unlawful due to her prior union with his brother Arthur. He cited passages from Leviticus and claimed that his lack of male heirs was divine punishment for this supposed sin. The Pope, caught in a web of international politics, particularly the influence of Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, refused to grant the annulment. This impasse set the stage for a crisis that Anne would help transform into a revolution, and began to advocate for an idea that had been brewing in reformist circles, that kings, not popes, should hold ultimate authority in their own realms. She promoted clerics like Thomas Cranmer and scholars like Thomas Cromwell, both of whom would become key architects of the English Reformation. Her ability to identify and support men of influence allowed her to extend her reach into the corridors of power, even before she became queen. Through these relationships, Anne helped to create the ideological framework that would justify Henry's eventual break from Rome. As Henry's frustration with the papacy grew, Anne encouraged him to see the annulment not as a matter of papal dispensation but as a question of divine law. If the Pope would not allow Henry to marry Anne, then perhaps England no longer needed to recognize the Pope's authority. This line of thinking was revolutionary. It aligned with Henry's growing belief in the sovereignty of the crown and provided the justification for the Act of Supremacy, which declared the king the supreme head of the Church of England. Though Henry's theological convictions remained largely Catholic, the political and personal benefits of religious independence proved irresistible. Anne's role in this transformation was not merely inspirational but active. She arranged meetings, circulated reformist literature, and lobbied for the elevation of allies who would support Henry's cause. She encouraged Henry to adopt the language of divine right and framed his desire for a male heir as a moral and national imperative. Anne was not a passive muse but a political operator who understood that her survival depended on a radical reordering of power. Her ambitions, though often condemned by her enemies as manipulative or vain, were underpinned by a coherent vision of reform and royal sovereignty. Yet Anne's growing power also made her vulnerable. Her relationship with Henry alienated powerful figures at court, including Catherine's supporters and staunch Catholics who viewed Anne as a heretic and usurper. Rumors about her character circulated widely. Accusations of witchcraft, vanity, and seduction were common. Her refusal to conform to traditional expectations of female behavior invited suspicion. She was seen as overly political, too opinionated, and dangerously independent. The qualities that had initially attracted Henry were the same ones that many believed made her unfit to be queen. Nevertheless, Anne pressed forward. In 1533, after years of secret courtship and political struggle, Henry and Anne married in a private ceremony. The marriage was declared lawful by Thomas Cranmer, now Archbishop of Canterbury. soon after, and was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony that emphasized her status not just as royal consort but as the mother of the future heir. Her coronation was highly symbolic. It was the first time a queen was crowned with the crown of St. Edward, traditionally reserved for monarchs. The message was clear: Anne's queenship was not subordinate but foundational to the new Tudor order. Anne's rise was, by any measure, extraordinary. She had gone from a lady-in-waiting to a queen whose influence helped reshape the religious and political landscape of England. Her insistence on marriage rather than concubinage forced Henry to defy the Pope and establish the Church of England. Her religious leanings introduced reformist ideas to the highest levels of government. Her patronage of scholars, preachers, and translators fueled the growth of English Protestantism, even if her own religious views were more complex and moderate than later generations assumed. Yet even as she reached the height of her power, Anne's position remained precarious. The hopes placed in her to deliver a male heir would prove her undoing, just as they had for Catherine. Still, at this stage in her rise, Anne Boleyn was not only Henry's wife but his partner in a grand political and religious project. She had captivated the most powerful man in England, redefined the possibilities of queenship, and laid the groundwork for the English Reformation. Her story was not simply one of personal ambition but of profound and lasting historical change. Henry VIII's pursuit of an annulment from Katherine of Aragon, a conflict known to history as the King's Great Matter, was more than a domestic marital dispute. It was a complex entanglement of personal desire, dynastic urgency, theological controversy, and international diplomacy. The stakes were monumental, and the repercussions would permanently alter the religious and political fabric of England. At the center of the issue was Henry's obsessive quest for a legitimate male heir, driven by fears of dynastic instability and compounded by his infatuation with Anne Boleyn. What began as a request for ecclesiastical permission turned into a battle that eventually tore England from the authority of the Pope and the Catholic Church. Henry's primary justification for seeking an annulment from Catherine stemmed from a particular passage in the book of Leviticus, which states that if a man takes his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing, and they shall be childless. Although Catherine insisted that her marriage to Arthur, Henry's older brother, had never been consummated and thus did not violate biblical law, Henry increasingly viewed his lack of a male heir as divine punishment for this supposed transgression. He clung to this interpretation as both a religious and legal argument. Yet it was clear that these theological concerns were tightly bound to Henry's personal motivations. After over 20 years of marriage, Catherine had borne him only one surviving child, Princess Mary. As Catherine aged and it became evident she would not bear another child, let alone a son, Henry's anxiety grew. He feared that the absence of a male heir would plunge the realm into civil unrest, much like the Wars of the Roses had done in the previous century. For a king obsessed with legacy and stability, this was intolerable. Catherine, however, refused to concede to the annulment. She maintained unwaveringly that her marriage to Henry was lawful and sanctified by God. She argued not only from the basis of personal truth, asserting that she came to Henry's bed as a virgin, but also from moral and religious conviction. For her, marriage was a sacrament, inviolable and ordained by divine will. To accept an annulment would be to betray her vows, her daughter's legitimacy, and her faith. Catherine's resistance was not passive. She actively campaigned to defend her rights. She sent letters to powerful figures, appealed to her nephew Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and gave eloquent speeches in court. One of the most memorable moments in the entire crisis occurred when Catherine knelt before Henry during a tribunal at Blackfriars in 1529, begging him to recognize her loyalty and truth. Her dignified defiance stirred sympathy throughout the realm and among much of the nobility. As Henry pushed for an annulment, the battle moved into the legal and religious arenas. Initially, Henry placed his trust in Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, his Lord Chancellor and a powerful figure in both English and papal circles. Wolsey was tasked with securing the annulment through canonical means, ideally by persuading Pope Clement VII to issue a dispensation declaring the marriage invalid. But Wolsey's efforts were thwarted at every turn. The Pope, though sympathetic to Henry's concerns, was a virtual prisoner in Rome following the sack of the city by troops loyal to Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew. Any move by the Pope to grant an annulment would antagonize Charles and jeopardize the fragile balance of power in Europe. Consequently, Clement prevaricated, delayed, and ultimately refused to make a definitive ruling. Wolsey's failure marked the end of his influence at court. Henry, frustrated and increasingly impatient, blamed him for the impasse and stripped him of his offices. Wolsey's downfall created a power vacuum, soon filled by two men who would reshape the course of English history, Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell. Cranmer, a learned theologian with reformist leanings, proposed a radical idea that the question of the king's marriage should be settled not by Rome but by the English clergy and universities. Cromwell, a brilliant and ruthless administrator, saw in Henry's predicament an opportunity to redefine the very structure of English governance. He advocated for royal supremacy in both secular and spiritual matters, arguing that the king's authority came directly from God, not the Pope. This shift in strategy transformed the annulment from a legal matter into a constitutional revolution. Under Cromwell's guidance, Parliament began enacting legislation that transferred religious authority from the Pope to the king. The Act in Restraint of Appeals declared that all legal appeals in ecclesiastical matters would henceforth be heard in England, not Rome. This was followed by the Act of Supremacy, which recognized Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England. With these laws in place, the annulment no longer required papal consent. The English Church, now subordinate to the Crown, could declare Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void. Cranmer, who had been appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, presided over the proceedings that formalized the annulment in 1533. The decision was swift. Henry's marriage to Catherine was declared invalid, and his secret marriage to Anne Boleyn was proclaimed lawful. By this time Anne was already pregnant, and the urgency to legitimize their union was paramount. Soon after, Anne was crowned queen, and Elizabeth, future Queen of England, was born. Despite the legal and political triumph, public opinion remained divided and in many quarters hostile. Catherine retained a great deal of popular support. She was widely seen as a wronged woman, virtuous, faithful, and unjustly cast aside. Many English people, especially in the north and among the clergy, continued to regard her as the rightful queen. The loyalty she inspired was due not only to her long tenure as consort but also to her piety and charitable works. Her resistance to the annulment was seen as a noble stand against tyranny. In contrast, Anne Boleyn was viewed by many as an interloper, her rise attributed to manipulation, ambition, and seduction. The clergy too was divided. While some reform-minded clerics supported Henry's new religious authority, many remained loyal to Rome and to the traditional structures of the Church. Bishops and abbots who opposed the annulment faced intense pressure, and some, like Bishop John Fisher, openly defied the king and paid for their resistance with their lives. The execution of Thomas More, Henry's former chancellor and a staunch Catholic, sent a chilling message to those who might challenge the royal supremacy. Internationally, the annulment caused a diplomatic crisis. Spain, incensed by Catherine's treatment, threatened retaliation. Charles V, already hostile to England for its religious defiance, now saw his aunt publicly humiliated. He pressured the Pope to excommunicate Henry and took measures to isolate England diplomatically. The Pope did eventually declare Henry's marriage to Anne null and void and reaffirmed Catherine's status as the legitimate queen. However, the damage had been done. Henry, having already severed ties with Rome, paid little heed to papal authority. The ripple effects of the king's great matter extended beyond royal bedrooms and ecclesiastical courts. The redefinition of royal authority, the suppression of monastic institutions, and the reallocation of church wealth all stemmed from this initial conflict. The establishment of the Church of England allowed for a more centralized and absolute form of monarchy, one in which the king's word became law not only in civil but also in spiritual matters. The religious landscape of England would never be the same. Catherine's refusal to accept the annulment never wavered. Even after being banished from court, separated from her daughter, and stripped of her title, she insisted on being referred to as queen and continued to pray for Henry's soul. She died in 1536, isolated but unbroken. Her death marked the end of a long and painful chapter in Tudor history but also served as a testament to her dignity and strength. The king's great matter was thus far more than a royal love triangle. It was the crucible in which modern England was forged, a seismic event that reshaped church, state, and the very nature of power. Henry's desire to annul his marriage set into motion a chain of events that would bring about the English Reformation, redefine the monarchy, and divide the Christian world. Though driven by personal motives, the consequences of Henry's decision transcended the private sphere and entered the realm of transformative historical change. The conflict between Katherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn was more than a political struggle over the English crown. It was a deeply personal, intimate war between two women who once shared courtly space and mutual respect, but were gradually forced into opposition by the ambitions, insecurities, and passions of a king whose obsession divided his court and country. Their rivalry, often portrayed through the lens of Henry VIII's desires, was equally a story of personal resolve and emotional endurance, set against the backdrop of one of the most transformative periods in English history. Catherine's refusal to relinquish her position as queen was a profound act of defiance rooted in her religious faith, personal dignity, and unwavering belief in the sanctity of her marriage. She had been married to Henry for more than 20 years when Anne Boleyn entered the picture not as a mere mistress, but as a potential replacement. For Catherine, stepping aside meant denying her vows, undermining her daughter Mary's legitimacy, and publicly conceding to the idea that she had been nothing more than a temporary fixture in Henry's life. Her Catholic convictions held that marriage was a sacrament, indissoluble except by death. To concede to the annulment would be to dishonor not only herself but also God's will. Even under pressure, humiliation, and isolation, she maintained that she was the true Queen of England and continued to sign letters as such. This unwavering stance gave her immense moral authority and garnered sympathy both within the court and across Europe. Anne, on the other hand, was not a woman with the patience or disposition to accept a lesser role. She had waited nearly 7 years for her place beside Henry, watching as obstacles mounted and her reputation suffered. Anne's ambition had driven her to resist becoming Henry's mistress, and her reward for that resistance was the promise of a crown. But that crown came with endless delays, venomous gossip, and a population that refused to embrace her as queen. Anne's frustration mounted with each passing year of uncertainty. She saw Catherine's refusal not only as an act of defiance against Henry, but as a personal insult to her own dignity and future. In Anne's mind, she had earned her place through strategy, love, and sacrifice. The longer Catherine held on, the more precarious Anne's position became. Her rivalry with Catherine grew sharper, more personal, and more desperate with time. Court life became a stage on which the rivalry was played out in subtle, cutting performances. Catherine and Anne never exchanged open insults, but the tension between them infected the entire Tudor court. Courtiers were forced to choose sides: those loyal to Catherine, often rooted in Catholic traditionalism, and those who aligned with Anne, many of whom supported reform and saw opportunity in the emerging religious order. The court's energy shifted, its factions sharpened. Even familial and long-standing friendships were tested, as men and women calculated their loyalties based on political survival rather than affection or principle. Public perception of both women was shaped by rumor, court gossip, and increasingly by formal channels of propaganda. Catherine was often portrayed in popular opinion as the wronged and virtuous wife, dignified, devout, and unfairly discarded. Her Spanish heritage and deep Catholic faith aligned her with traditional values that resonated with many subjects. Chroniclers sympathetic to her described her as a saintly figure, enduring injustice with grace. Her appearance in court, wrapped in somber colors and prayerful stillness, only reinforced this image. She was a martyr queen, embodying the feminine virtues of patience, obedience to God, and moral rectitude. In stark contrast, Anne Boleyn was frequently depicted as the interloper, the seductress who disrupted the natural order. Satires and slanderous pamphlets circulated, painting her as manipulative, heretical, and even sexually deviant. Some accused her of bewitching the king. Others implied that she was unfaithful or involved in incest. These depictions were not merely personal attacks, they were tools of political resistance used by those who viewed Anne's rise as symbolic of religious and social upheaval. Reformers, however, offered an alternative image. To them, Anne was the new Esther or Deborah, a queen sent by divine providence to guide England out of papal darkness. Protestant writers praised her learning, her patronage of reformist scholars, and her role in breaking Rome's hold over English religious life. Thus, Anne and Catherine became not just rival queens but rival symbols of competing worldviews. The psychological toll of this sustained conflict was profound for both women. Catherine's isolation increased steadily after her banishment from court. She was moved from residence to residence, often forbidden contact with her daughter and deprived of news from the court. Her household was diminished, and many of her closest allies were removed from her service. The once celebrated queen found herself confined to a kind of genteel imprisonment. Yet even in solitude she maintained her resolve. Her letters reveal a woman hurt but not broken, clinging to her faith and dignity in the face of public rejection. She continued to dress as a queen, referred to herself as such, and demanded the same from those around her. Her suffering, while private, became public in its moral force. She was, to her supporters, England's rightful queen, resilient, devout, and enduring. Anne's mental and emotional state was no less burdened. Though crowned and married to Henry, she never felt secure in her position. Her inability to quickly produce a male heir haunted her, and the birth of a daughter, Elizabeth, though healthy and strong, was a bitter disappointment to the king. Anne faced enormous pressure, knowing that failure could cost her not only her title but her life. She became increasingly paranoid, convinced that enemies at court were plotting her downfall. Her temperament, already sharp and passionate, grew more volatile. She clashed frequently with Henry, especially as his affections began to wane. Court reports speak of her rages, her jealousies, and her increasingly desperate attempts to retain the king's love. Anne's relationship with Princess Mary, Catherine's daughter, also became a source of tension and cruelty. Mary, steadfast in her loyalty to her mother, refused to recognize Anne as queen. In response, Anne pressured Henry to punish Mary both to assert her own legitimacy and to solidify the position of her daughter Elizabeth. This dynamic poisoned the court even further, as it placed mother and daughter against another mother and daughter in a tragic echo of the larger struggle. As Anne's favor declined, she grew more isolated, much like Catherine had before her. Ironically, the roles reversed. The once dismissed queen now attracted pity and sympathy, while Anne began to suffer from the same loneliness, anxiety, and marginalization she had once helped impose on Catherine. Though their personalities and methods were different, both women endured tremendous psychological strain, each believing in the rightness of her cause, each punished in different ways by a system that gave them power only so long as they produced male heirs and served the king's emotional needs. Their war was not one of armies or open rebellion, but of presence and defiance. Catherine's strength came from her refusal to yield, from her silence and her prayers. Anne's power was forged in ambition, sustained by charisma, and undone by unmet expectations. Both queens were consumed by the pressures placed upon them in a patriarchal court that turned personal relationships into national crises. Henry's shifting affections, the hunger for succession, and the collision of old and new religious ideologies created a battlefield in which neither woman could fully triumph. The conflict between Catherine and Anne was shaped by circumstance as much as by character. Catherine's long years as queen had forged deep roots of loyalty, while Anne's rise symbolized a changing England, one more assertive, reformist, and modern. They were both victims and agents of history, caught in a struggle that was as emotional as it was political. Their rivalry may have been framed by Henry's desires, but it was sustained by two powerful and intelligent women who refused to yield in the face of humiliation and defeat. Their war, fought in courtrooms, palaces, and hearts, left lasting marks not only on each other but on the history of a kingdom that would never be the same again. After the bitter conflict that defined the later years of her marriage to Henry VIII, Katherine of Aragon faced a slow and deliberate fall from power that was as painful as it was unjust. Having once been the celebrated queen consort of England, the daughter of Spanish monarchs, and a symbol of moral authority and Catholic virtue, she found herself stripped of her titles, removed from court, and separated from the people and institutions that had once given her life structure and dignity. Her fall was not marked by dramatic confrontation, but rather by systematic marginalization, a quiet exile carefully engineered to remove her influence while silencing her protest. Henry's declaration that his marriage to Catherine was invalid triggered a series of actions that effectively exiled her from political and familial life. Catherine was moved from palace to palace, first to the Moor, then to Buckden, and finally to Kimbolton Castle, each step placing her farther from the court and from her daughter, Mary. These residences were not prison cells, but they were certainly symbolic of confinement. The grandeur and privilege she had once known gave way to cold stone walls, reduced staff, and limited resources. The courtiers and attendants loyal to her were dismissed or replaced, and her contact with the outside world was heavily monitored. Despite being forced into increasingly austere circumstances, Catherine maintained her habits and decorum as if she were still queen. She insisted on being addressed as such, dressed with royal formality, and maintained a dignified household despite the conditions. Perhaps the most heart-wrenching blow to Catherine was the enforced separation from her daughter. Mary, like her mother, refused to recognize Anne Boleyn as queen and continued to refer to herself as the legitimate heir to the throne. Her defiance, though quietly heroic, was dangerous. Henry and Anne viewed her loyalty to Catherine as a direct threat to their daughter Elizabeth's position. As a result, Mary was kept apart from her mother and subjected to increasing psychological and political pressure. For Catherine, the inability to see or protect Mary must have been agonizing. She had always placed her daughter at the center of her aspirations and her prayers. Letters from Catherine during this time reveal her anguish but also her determination to shield Mary through counsel and encouragement. Even when stripped of power, she remained a mother first, writing words of comfort and strength from the cold seclusion of Kimbolton. Catherine did not passively accept her fate. In her final years, she remained politically engaged through a series of appeals and correspondences. She continued to write to the Pope, to her nephew Charles V, and to influential supporters within England and abroad, urging them to intervene on her behalf. Her appeals were eloquent, respectful, and full of moral clarity. She presented herself not as a dethroned queen seeking revenge, but as a wronged wife and mother seeking justice. Her faith in the Catholic Church never wavered, and she held out hope that papal intervention might still restore her rightful status. Yet these hopes were ultimately in vain. The political landscape had shifted too dramatically, and Henry's break with Rome had closed off all avenues of clerical arbitration. Still, Catherine's letters offered a voice of conscience in an increasingly turbulent and cynical court. They were reminders of a queen whose strength came not from armies or political maneuvering, but from unshakable faith and moral certainty. In isolation, Catherine created a routine shaped by piety and discipline. Her days were filled with prayer, reading scripture, and performing acts of charity within her limited means. She observed fasts, wore simple clothing, and gave what she could to the poor. Her devotion became legendary, even among those who had once favored her removal. Her former servants and allies continued to revere her, spreading tales of her endurance and grace under pressure. This quiet sanctity would later fuel movements that sought her canonization, unofficial and grassroots in nature, but heartfelt and widespread. Catherine's health, however, began to decline. Years of emotional strain, coupled with the physical toll of her harsh living conditions, wore her down. She suffered from illnesses that went untreated or poorly managed. Despite her suffering, she never renounced her title or faith. In January 1536, as the bitter English winter descended, Catherine's condition worsened rapidly. On January 7, she died at Kimbolton Castle, far from court, far from her daughter, and far from the splendor that had once defined her life. Her final hours were marked by serenity, according to witnesses. She was attended by a small group of loyal servants and is said to have spent her last moments in prayer. Catherine's death was met with mixed reactions. Among her supporters, there was grief and a profound sense of loss. News of her passing spread quickly, and in many English households candles were lit, and prayers were offered for the queen they believed had been wronged. In Spain, her death was mourned as a national tragedy. Her nephew Charles V received the news with sorrow, recognizing not only the personal loss but also the symbolic significance of her passing. She had represented the Spanish alliance and Catholic orthodoxy, both of which had suffered in the years since her fall. Even some in England who had accepted the new religious order felt a pang of guilt or regret at her treatment. Her dignity in death only reinforced the admiration many had long felt. At court the response was more muted. Henry reportedly showed little outward grief, and Anne Boleyn was said to have celebrated the news, though some accounts, possibly exaggerated by later chroniclers, described her dressing in yellow on the day the death was announced. Whether this was a gesture of celebration or a misunderstood expression of mourning remains debated. Regardless, Catherine's passing removed a source of anxiety from Anne's life, though it did little to solidify her own precarious position, which would unravel in the months to come. The timing was ironic. Catherine died in January, and Anne was executed in May of the same year. The woman who had been cast aside to make way for a new queen outlived her rival's reign by mere weeks. Following her death, Catherine was buried not in the grand tombs of kings and queens but at Peterborough Cathedral, in a ceremony befitting a dowager princess, not a queen consort. The modest funeral rankled many who believed she deserved greater honors. Yet over time her grave became a site of pilgrimage. People left offerings, flowers, and prayers at her tomb. Her memory was venerated not just by Catholics but by others who admired her strength, her faith, and her resilience in the face of injustice. In the years and decades following her death, Catherine's reputation grew even more luminous. She came to be viewed as a martyr by many English Catholics, especially under the reign of her daughter, Mary I. Though never officially canonized, there were local and informal movements that treated her as a saint. Stories circulated of miracles associated with her name. Paintings and devotional materials portrayed her as a woman of suffering and grace. While Henry VIII attempted to erase her memory through policy and propaganda, the emotional impact of her life and death could not be contained. Catherine's legacy endured not through political triumph but through moral example. She stood firm when most would have yielded, and she clung to her principles even as the world she knew collapsed around her. She refused to allow her identity to be defined by the whims of a king or the shifts of a court. Her unwavering loyalty to her faith, her daughter, and her vows gave her a kind of power that Henry, for all his authority, could not break. Her story became emblematic of feminine strength in adversity, a narrative of resistance shaped not by rebellion, but by quiet, resolute faith. Katherine of Aragon's fall was in many ways a tragedy. But it was also a testament to character and endurance. Though removed from the court and history's center stage, she remained unbroken, leaving behind a legacy that would be remembered not in titles or triumphs, but in the hearts of those who saw in her a reflection of courage, sacrifice, and unshakable integrity. Her memory lived on in the reverence of her followers, in the lessons she passed to her daughter, and in the evolving narrative of what it meant to be a queen in a world that often demanded silence and submission. In refusing to yield, Katherine wrote her own chapter in the long, tumultuous history of the Tudor dynasty, one marked not by victory, but by timeless dignity. Anne Boleyn's rise to the throne was unprecedented and extraordinary, a dazzling victory after years of strategic patience, relentless ambition, and emotional endurance. Her coronation as queen was not simply a crowning ceremony, it was the dramatic culmination of a seismic transformation in English political and religious life. Henry VIII's marriage to Anne was both the cause and consequence of England's break with Rome, and her elevation to queen signified a new order. But if Anne's triumph was meteoric, so too was her downfall. Her reign lasted barely 3 years, bookended by adulation and accusation, splendor and scandal, love and betrayal. The arc of her life at court reveals the brutal volatility of Tudor politics, and the fatal cost of proximity to the king's power. Anne's coronation in June 1533 was designed to affirm not just her legitimacy, but her supremacy. It was a grand affair, filled with symbolism and magnificence. The event was steeped in political meaning, aimed at convincing both the nobility and the common people that Anne was now the rightful Queen of England, despite the controversy and discontent that had followed the annulment of Henry's marriage to Katherine of Aragon. The coronation route through London was elaborately decorated. Fountains flowed with wine, plays and tableaux exalted fertility and virtue, and Anne's image was displayed in majestic forms to emphasize her beauty, grace and regal stature. Henry spared no expense, and Anne, resplendent in gold and crimson robes, was crowned not merely queen consort but queen regnant, an extraordinary designation intended to elevate her authority and reassure her supporters. Yet public reaction was deeply mixed. While many nobles and reformist courtiers celebrated Anne's coronation as the birth of a new era, the broader population harbored doubts, resentment, or outright hostility. Katherine remained beloved by many, and Anne's rapid rise from lady-in-waiting to queen accompanied by the king's rejection of his lawful wife struck many as scandalous and unnatural. Whispered slurs about Anne's virtue and rumors of her influence over Henry's religious choices made her appear more of an enchantress than a divinely ordained queen. Some even muttered that her coronation was blasphemy. The cheers were not as loud, the crowds not as enthusiastic as they had been for Katherine. Anne, aware of this ambivalence, tried to present herself as generous, graceful, and pious, but the shadow of her predecessor lingered over every step. Once married, and believed she had finally secured the future she had fought so long to attain. She was pregnant during the coronation, and Henry confidently expected a male heir. That child, however, turned out to be a daughter, Elizabeth, born in September 1533. Although Henry initially tried to present the birth positively, the absence of a son was a serious disappointment. Nevertheless, Elizabeth was healthy, and devoted herself to motherhood with pride and optimism. She believed future pregnancies would deliver the desired male heir and solidify her standing. As queen, Anne was active in politics and religion. She promoted reformist scholars, influenced appointments to church and state offices, and even sought diplomatic influence. Her relationship with Henry, at first deeply passionate, now entered a new phase. A queen must maintain royal favor while producing heirs and avoiding scandal, an almost impossible balance in a court defined by rumor and rivalry. But Anne's future pregnancies ended in heartbreak. She suffered at least 2 miscarriages after Elizabeth, possibly 3, and each failure further weakened her position. In 1536, a particularly tragic miscarriage occurred soon after Henry suffered a jousting accident that left him unconscious for hours. The lost child was reportedly a boy. Anne's grief was compounded by Henry's growing coldness. Her failure to deliver a son fed into broader anxieties about her fitness as queen. Unlike Katherine, who had enjoyed long-standing loyalty and spiritual legitimacy, and had few powerful allies once Henry's affections began to wane, her enemies, many of whom had been waiting for an opportunity to strike, began to maneuver against her. The court, ever mercurial, sensed the shift in Henry's feelings and began to recalibrate its loyalties accordingly. Anne's personality, once seen as captivating and intelligent, now came under harsh scrutiny. Her quick temper, sharp tongue, and assertive manner tolerated or even admired when she was Henry's lover were seen as arrogance and volatility in a queen. The qualities that had enabled her ascent now contributed to her isolation. Her enemies, including Thomas Cromwell, began to view her as a political liability. Cromwell, who had once allied with Anne to secure the break with Rome, found her religious idealism and foreign policy views increasingly troublesome. Moreover, Henry had begun to take interest in Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting whose quiet demeanor contrasted starkly with Anne's forceful presence. And, aware of the growing distance between herself and the king, tried to regain his affection through charm and appeals to their shared past, but the effort was futile. The court soon became a dangerous place for Anne. Rumors about her personal behavior began to swirl, and Cromwell moved to exploit them. Whether Henry directly ordered her downfall or simply gave tacit approval remains a subject of historical debate, but what followed was a masterclass in political destruction. In April and May of 1536, Anne was arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and conspiracy to kill the king. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, but they were strategically devastating. 5 men, including her brother George Boleyn, were accused of having illicit relations with the queen. The trials were held quickly and publicly, offering the illusion of legal legitimacy while ensuring a predetermined outcome. Anne maintained her innocence throughout. Her interrogations revealed a woman both bewildered and indignant, proud yet deeply shaken by the betrayal of those she had trusted. The charges against her were grotesque and improbable. No serious historian believes the accusations were true, yet they served their purpose. They removed Anne from the court, allowed Henry to remarry, and eliminated a faction that had grown politically inconvenient. Anne's trial was a spectacle. She defended herself with composure and intelligence, reportedly leaving some onlookers moved by her dignity. But the verdict was inevitable. She was condemned to death, stripped of her titles, and held in the Tower of London. Even in confinement, she displayed remarkable poise. Her last days were marked by reflection, prayer, and letters to her family. She hoped to be remembered not as a sinner or traitor, but as a woman who had served her king and country. And was executed on May 19, 1536. Her beheading was carried out by a French swordsman, a gesture of supposed mercy orchestrated by Henry. Dressed in a simple gray gown with a cloak of ermine, she addressed the crowd with dignity. She made no accusations against Henry, instead offering prayers for his health and the realm. Her speech was calm, composed, and deeply poignant. She was executed with a single blow, and her remains were hastily buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower. The very place that had witnessed her triumph as queen now became the site of her violent end. Henry's reaction to Anne's death was cold, even callous. Within days he was betrothed to Jane Seymour, and the court swiftly moved to erase Anne's memory. Her portraits were removed, her initials carved out of stonework, her supporters purged. It was as though she had never existed. Yet Anne's legacy could not be so easily erased. Her daughter, Elizabeth, though declared illegitimate, would one day rise to the throne and become one of England's most celebrated monarchs. In Elizabeth, Anne's political vision and intellectual vigor found a living continuation. Anne's tragedy lies not only in her brutal end, but in the fleeting nature of her triumph. She had achieved what no other woman had before. She had altered the course of history by the force of her personality and conviction. She was instrumental in the English Reformation, a patron of reformist thinkers, and a queen who tried to define her own destiny. But in a world that punished ambition in women, especially those who challenged established hierarchies, Anne's very success made her vulnerable. Her story is not merely one of a woman undone by love or politics, it is the story of a figure caught between the expectations of a patriarchal monarchy and the dangerous allure of personal agency. Anne Boleyn remains one of history's most enigmatic and polarizing queens. Celebrated by some as a proto-feminist icon and vilified by others as a manipulative usurper, her life and death continue to captivate imaginations. Her legacy is inseparable from the dramatic events of the English Reformation, the birth of Elizabeth I, and the transformation of the monarchy itself. In triumph, she redefined what it meant to be queen. In tragedy, she exposed the peril of royal favor. Anne's life was brief but incandescent, a flame that illuminated the heights of power and the depths of betrayal in equal measure. Her fate serves as both a cautionary tale and an enduring testament to the complexity of human ambition in the most treacherous of courts. Mary Tudor and Elizabeth Tudor, the daughters of Katherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn respectively, were born into a world shaped by fierce rivalry, personal tragedy, and seismic political change. Their lives, deeply entangled with their mother's fates, reflect not only the personal costs of Henry VIII's obsession with a male heir but also the far-reaching consequences of two women caught in the eye of England's religious and dynastic storms. Mary and Elizabeth would grow to become queens in their own right, each one bearing the marks of her mother's legacy whether in continuity or in conscious rejection. The rivalry of their mothers did not end in death. It reverberated through their daughters' lives, shaping England's future through conflicting ideologies, styles of rule and personal identity. Mary Tudor was born in 1516 to Katherine of Aragon, after years of unsuccessful pregnancies. As the only surviving child of Katherine and Henry VIII, Mary was from birth a symbol of hope and dynastic continuity. Her early years were marked by status and privilege. She was highly educated, fluent in Latin, skilled in music, and devoted to the Catholic faith much like her mother. Her future seemed secure, especially as Europe recognized her as a legitimate princess and potential marriage partner. But the stability of Mary's childhood was built on the fragile assumption that Catherine would either produce a male heir or continue to enjoy Henry's unshakable loyalty. When Anne Boleyn entered the picture, Mary's life would be forever transformed. Mary's relationship with Anne Boleyn was poisoned by the political and personal strife between their mothers. As Anne's influence over Henry grew, Catherine's position weakened, and Mary's status followed. Once declared the heir presumptive, she was demoted to Lady Mary, labeled illegitimate and separated from her mother. Her refusal to accept Anne as queen earned her Anne's animosity and Henry's harsh rebuke. Anne reportedly resented Mary's defiance and saw her as a lingering symbol of Catherine's influence. For Mary, Anne was the usurper, the cause of her mother's disgrace, and the reason for her own suffering. Forced to serve in the household of her infant half-sister Elizabeth, Mary endured years of humiliation, isolation, and psychological strain. After Anne's execution, Mary had hoped to be restored fully to her father's favor, but Henry's insistence on the legitimacy of his second marriage and his third marriage to Jane Seymour meant Mary had to formally acknowledge her illegitimacy and her father's supremacy over the church. It was a painful concession. Though she regained some courtly favor, the spiritual and emotional scars of her fall from grace remained. When Mary finally came to the throne in 1553, following the brief reign of her Protestant half-brother Edward VI and the failed attempt to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne, she sought to restore not only Catholicism but also her mother's legacy. She believed that her cause was divinely sanctioned, a mission to correct the wrongs done to Catherine and to herself. Her early reign was welcomed by many, as the rightful daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine returned England to what was perceived as religious orthodoxy. But her zealous commitment to the Catholic cause led to the persecution of Protestants, with hundreds burned at the stake in what became known as the Marian persecutions. Her moniker Bloody Mary would later overshadow her genuine intentions and diplomatic efforts. Yet to Mary it was never about bloodlust, it was about saving souls, about righteousness, and about restoring a kingdom she believed had been led astray by her father's heresy and Anne Boleyn's ambition. Mary's deep religiosity and political conservatism reflected her mother's values, but her reign was also marked by the burden of personal loneliness and political insecurity. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain, a deeply unpopular union, and her failure to produce an heir reinforced the tragic echoes of Catherine's life. Like her mother, Mary would die with her legacy contested, childless, and leaving behind a religiously divided kingdom. She saw herself as Catherine's daughter to the end, the true queen, the Catholic defender, the woman who had endured and finally triumphed if only briefly. In contrast, Elizabeth Tudor's life was shaped by the trauma of her mother's downfall and the precarity of her own legitimacy. Born in 1533 to Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth had been a celebrated infant, with hopes resting on her potential as the firstborn of Henry's new marriage. But when Anne was executed in 1536, Elizabeth was just 2 years old. She was declared illegitimate, her title stripped, and her mother's memory blackened by accusations of adultery and treason. Elizabeth never publicly defended Anne, nor did she speak often of her. Whether this was political caution or personal conflict is unknown, but the absence of overt homage speaks volumes. Educated by some of the finest tutors in Europe, Elizabeth became a master of languages, rhetoric, and diplomacy. She absorbed the intellectual spirit of the Renaissance and cultivated a cool, calculating persona that kept her alive in the volatile Tudor court. She learned the art of survival through silence, discretion, and charm, qualities and had lacked or refused to deploy. Elizabeth's mother had been fiery, outspoken, and politically aggressive. Elizabeth became prudent, measured, and enigmatic. When Elizabeth took the throne in 1558, following the death of her half-sister Mary, She inherited a kingdom exhausted by religious conflict and uncertain about its future. Her first challenge was to establish her legitimacy not just as the daughter of a disgraced queen, but as a ruler in her own right. She carefully navigated the divisions between Catholics and Protestants, presenting herself as the Virgin Queen, married to her people and her country, and placing political stability above personal or ideological zeal. Her religious settlement in 1559 sought a middle way, one that avoided the extremes of both Mary's persecutions and the more radical Protestant reforms. In many ways, Elizabeth's reign can be read as a quiet repudiation of her mother's fate. She never married, perhaps understanding the dangers of power shared with a consort. She controlled her image ruthlessly, turning her femininity into a tool of political power rather than vulnerability. Where and had sought legitimacy through marriage and motherhood, Elizabeth made autonomy and prudence her throne's cornerstones. Yet it would be reductive to say that Elizabeth rejected Anne entirely. Her intelligence, cultural patronage, and self-awareness echo her mother's strengths. Anne's influence, perhaps more subtle than overt, lived on in Elizabeth's refusal to be defined by scandal or sentiment. The contrasting legacies of Mary and Elizabeth I illuminate not only the influence of their mothers but also the divergent paths of England's religious and political evolution. Mary embodied the resilience and righteousness of Katherine of Aragon, but also her inflexibility and emotional earnestness. Her reign was shaped by a belief in divine justice and a need to redress personal and national wrongs. Yet in doing so she became isolated, associated with repression, and ultimately unable to secure her goals. Elizabeth, conversely, embodied the cunning and charisma of Anne Boleyn, but tempered with strategic restraint. Her reign was marked by cultural flourishing, relative religious peace, and enduring popularity, despite the shadow of her birth. Their lives also reflect the broader narrative of women's power in a patriarchal society. Both daughters had to contend with the legacy of maternal conflict, using it as both burden and guide. Mary's rule was defined by honoring her mother's memory, often at great personal and political cost. Elizabeth, while never denying her mother's identity, crafted a public life that sidestepped emotional entanglements and rooted her authority in personal merit rather than maternal lineage. In doing so, she forged a path forward that was distinctly her own. The rivalry of Catherine and Anne thus found its most enduring expression not in their personal disputes but in the daughters who succeeded them. The story of Mary and Elizabeth was not simply one of succession, but of contrasting approaches to power, faith, legitimacy, and survival. One sought to return England to an idealized past, the other to steer it toward a pragmatic future. One ruled as the daughter of a sainted queen, the other as the daughter of a disgraced one. Yet both, in their triumphs and failures, bore witness to the lasting impact of two women whose personal battle had once shaken a kingdom. The daughters of the rival queens did more than inherit their mother's legacies, they transformed them. Mary, through her devout adherence to the past, reminded England of what it once was and could no longer be. Elizabeth, through her adaptive brilliance, laid the foundations for a modern state. Though history has often judged them in contrast, they were alike in resilience, intellect, and determination. They ruled not just in the shadows of their mothers, but beyond them, each carving out a chapter of English history that bore the unmistakable imprint of rivalry, inheritance, and the indelible force of maternal memory. The rivalry between Katherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn was more than just a personal conflict over the affections of a monarch. It was a defining episode that reshaped England's political, religious, and cultural identity. What began as a courtly drama, two women vying for the favor and legitimacy of being queen, exploded into a generational transformation that spurred centuries of religious reform, succession crises, gender politics, and evolving historical memory. Their legacy cannot be isolated to the Tudor court. Instead, it spread outward through generations of English history, affecting the very fabric of monarchy, national religion, and the way powerful women have been perceived and portrayed through time. One of the most enduring consequences of their rivalry was religious. The annulment Henry VIII sought from Katherine of Aragon to Mary Anne Boleyn was not granted by the Pope, leading to a political and theological crisis that altered the trajectory of the nation. Henry's growing infatuation with and coincided with his frustration with the Catholic Church. Though Henry was never an ideological reformer in the mold of Martin Luther or John Calvin, his desire to marry and the inability to do so within the framework of Roman Catholic canon law forced him to consider alternatives. The creation of the Church of England was not born out of pure theological conviction but rather the desperation of a king to produce a male heir and establish his authority above papal interference. The English Reformation that followed had profound implications. It created a national church under the authority of the monarch, severing England's ties to Rome and fundamentally altering religious life. The dissolution of the monasteries, the redistribution of church lands, the standardization of religious texts in English, and the persecution of Catholics all stemmed from this initial rupture. Anne Boleyn, with her support for reformist clergy and her interest in the ideas of religious humanists like Erasmus and Luther, played a role in encouraging this movement, even if her influence waned as Henry's attention shifted and the political stakes escalated. Catherine, on the other hand, stood as a symbol of Catholic resilience, refusing to acknowledge the annulment and remaining a devout adherent to Rome until her death. Her dignity and suffering earned her reverence among Catholics both in England and abroad. The rivalry thus represented two opposing religious identities, Catherine's traditional Catholicism and Anne's reformist-leaning Protestantism. Though the English Reformation did not unfold cleanly or swiftly, and many aspects of Catholic ritual remained even under Henry's rule, the break from Rome was irreversible. In later decades, these opposing forces would manifest violently under the reigns of Mary I, who sought to restore Catholicism with intense persecution, and Elizabeth I, who solidified Protestantism through a more moderate but firm religious settlement. The seeds of these religious shifts were sown in the dramatic and very personal struggle between two queens who saw themselves as the rightful wife of Henry and, more significantly, the true mother of England's future. This religious upheaval also intersected with dynastic concerns. Henry's primary motivation in seeking to replace Catherine with Anne was his desperation for a male heir. He believed that Catherine, due to age or divine disapproval, could no longer provide him with one, and he feared civil unrest or foreign interference if the succession was not secured. Ironically, neither Catherine nor Anne succeeded in providing a living male heir. Catherine's son died in infancy, Anne's pregnancies ended in miscarriages and a stillborn son. Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, and Catherine's daughter, Mary, were declared illegitimate at different points, reflecting the deep instability created by the shifting affections and decisions of their father. But history would prove that the obsession with a male heir was ultimately unnecessary. Both Mary and Elizabeth would rule as queens regnant, challenging the long-held belief that a woman could not govern effectively. Their reigns, though vastly different in style and substance, demonstrated the capacities of female monarchs to wield power, command loyalty, and shape national identity. Mary's reign reinforced the connection between monarch and religion, though her Catholic zeal and foreign marriage to Philip II of Spain made her unpopular in many quarters. Elizabeth's reign brought relative stability, cultural renaissance, and the strengthening of the Protestant state. Her decision not to marry and remain the Virgin Queen not only redefined female authority but symbolically broke from the dynastic models that had driven her father to marry 6 times. The irony of Anne and Catherine's rivalry lies in the fact that their daughters succeeded where they could not. The very war over producing a male heir birthed 2 of the most influential queens in English history. Yet the rivalry also instilled lasting trauma into the monarchy. The crises of legitimacy that plagued both Mary and Elizabeth stemmed directly from their mothers' contested marriages. Each had to overcome not only political opposition but also public skepticism about their right to rule. This legacy of instability lingered into the Stuart era and beyond, as questions of legitimacy, religion, and gender continued to influence succession and governance. Culturally, the story of Catherine and Anne has captivated audiences for centuries. From the moment it unfolded, chroniclers, poets, and playwrights began to depict their rivalry, often framing it within the moral and gendered frameworks of their time. Catherine was frequently portrayed as the saintly, suffering queen, dignified, noble, and tragically discarded. Anne, in contrast, was cast as either a seductive interloper or a tragic reformer, depending on the writer's perspective. This polarization, saint versus sinner, martyr versus harlot, has persisted in literature and media, reinforcing simplistic binaries that fail to account for the complexity of both women. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Catholic and Protestant commentators used the 2 queens as symbols of their respective causes. Protestant reformers viewed Anne as a vehicle for religious enlightenment, while Catholics mourned Catherine as a victim of injustice and a model of piety. Over time, plays like Shakespeare's Henry VIII and later works would codify these images. Shakespeare, writing under Elizabeth's reign, walked a careful line portraying Anne in a positive light without directly confronting the political controversies surrounding her fall. Catherine, however, was granted some of the most powerful and poignant speeches in the play, highlighting her endurance and moral strength. In the modern era, historians have attempted to move beyond these binaries, offering more nuanced portraits of both women. Revisionist histories have emphasized Anne's intellectual agency, her political savvy, and her role in promoting religious reform. Scholars have reconsidered her downfall, noting the likely falsity of the charges against her and examining how factional court politics led to her execution. Similarly, Catherine has been re-examined not simply as a passive sufferer, but as a politically astute and deeply principled woman who fought for her rights and her daughter's future with unrelenting courage. Popular media in the 20th and 21st centuries has revived the rivalry with renewed interest. Novels, television series, and films have dramatized their conflict for new audiences, often reflecting contemporary views on feminism, agency, and historical injustice. Shows like The Tudors and books by authors like Philippa Gregory have brought emotional depth to their characters, though not without historical embellishment. These depictions have contributed to a broader cultural reimagining of the two women not as mere opposites, but as figures of empathy, strength, and tragedy. The rivalry has also become a symbol of larger themes: the precariousness of women's power in patriarchal systems, the destructiveness of dynastic ambition, and the profound consequences of personal relationships on political structures. Catherine and Anne's lives demonstrate how the personal is political, how intimate rivalries can ignite national revolutions, and how women's roles at court could both empower and endanger them. The fascination with their rivalry persists not because it is a simple tale of two women fighting over a man, but because it encapsulates the tensions of an age between old and new, faith and reform, tradition and innovation, patriarchy and the beginnings of female political power. It is a story with no clear villain or hero, only individuals caught in the relentless machinery of monarchy and belief. Their legacies, shaped by suffering, ambition, and resilience, continue to resonate as symbols of both progress and pain. In the end, the legacy of the rivalry between Katherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn is not confined to their own lifetimes. It reshaped England's religious identity, challenged assumptions about gender and rule, and created a dynastic narrative that would influence monarchs and ministers for generations. Their daughters embodied different visions of monarchy, and their memories have been kept alive through countless interpretations. Whether seen as adversaries, victims, or pioneers, both women remain central to the story of how England became the nation it is today. Their rivalry was the catalyst, but their legacy is the enduring flame that lit a transformative chapter in history. The story of Katherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn is ultimately one of ambition, conviction, identity, and human fragility woven into the sweeping fabric of political and religious upheaval. Their rivalry, while often reduced to a contest over a king's favor, is in truth far more profound. It serves as a prism through which the most turbulent transformations of Tudor England can be viewed: a reformation of religion, a redefining of monarchy, and a reimagining of women's roles and power. Yet even as these women shaped history in monumental ways, their lives also reveal the deeply human costs of political ascension and downfall, costs paid not only by them, but by those around them and generations to follow. At its heart, this was a deeply human conflict. Both Catherine and Anne were not only political figures but real women with emotions, loyalties, dreams, and vulnerabilities. Catherine, raised as a Spanish princess with expectations of dynastic greatness, believed deeply in her rightful place as queen and wife. Her devotion to Henry was sincere, and her identity was inseparable from her Catholic faith and sense of divine order. Her inability to produce a surviving male heir, something utterly beyond her control, came to define her worth in the eyes of others, diminishing none of her actual competence, dignity, or intelligence. Her steadfastness in the face of personal humiliation and political isolation speaks not only to her strength but also to the tragic limitations placed on women in her time. Anne, in contrast, emerged from less regal origins but possessed an extraordinary sense of ambition, cultivated through years at the European courts. Her charisma and intellect made her stand out, and her ability to capture Henry's interest without succumbing to him made her powerful in a way few women ever were. Yet her ascent was built on perilous foundations: political calculation, religious controversy, and a king's fickle desire. Once she became queen, the very things that had once empowered her sharp mind, her bold speech, her refusal to submit, became liabilities. When she failed to deliver a male heir as Catherine had before her, the same pressures led to her fall. Betrayed, tried, and executed, she became both a cautionary tale and a martyr of a new age. Their rivalry encapsulates the tragic paradox of Tudor power: the closer one came to the crown, the more fragile one's position became. In that sense, Catherine and Anne were not just rivals, they were mirrors of each other, each falling victim to the same patriarchal and dynastic expectations. Neither woman truly won. Catherine died in exile, denied her title and separated from her child. And died on the scaffold, charged with crimes most now agree were fabricated. Yet both irrevocably changed the course of English history. That paradox of personal defeat alongside historical triumph forms the essence of their legacy. This personal rivalry was also a microcosm of broader forces reshaping England. Religion was at the center of nearly every major decision surrounding their fates. Catherine's Catholicism, rooted in Spanish orthodoxy and tied to Rome, became a rallying point for traditionalists. Anne's alignment with reformist ideals, and her possession of banned texts like Tyndale's Bible, signaled a new age of theological questioning and political control over religious practice. Through them, the English Reformation was given its narrative and emotional core. It wasn't just about doctrine, it was about the Queen's identity, the heir's legitimacy, and the King's divine right. What began as a private crisis of marriage evolved into a national revolution of spiritual and institutional identity. Their conflict also magnified questions of legitimacy and succession. The children born of these rival queens, Mary and Elizabeth, were both declared illegitimate at different times. Each had to fight for their rights not only against political rivals but against the lingering shadows of their mothers' reputations. Mary, fierce in her Catholicism and bitter from years of marginalization, sought to restore what her mother had lost. Elizabeth, pragmatic and forward-thinking, chose not to let her mother's fate dictate her own path, but neither did she forget it. The bitter conflict between Catherine and Anne lived on in their daughters, shaping the policies, personalities, and tensions of their reigns. Centuries later, their story continues to captivate. It has all the elements of timeless drama: love, betrayal, ambition, faith, power, and downfall. Writers, artists, and filmmakers return to them again and again, not only because of their historical significance but because they embody fundamental human dilemmas. What is the cost of ambition? How does one navigate love and duty? How much power can a woman safely wield in a patriarchal society? Their lives ask these questions and, in some ways, offer answers, though often in the form of warnings rather than resolutions. Modern interpretations have shifted dramatically. For much of history, Catherine was lionized as the wronged wife and vilified as the seductress who destroyed a marriage. Later generations, influenced by feminism and deeper scholarship, have challenged this binary, and is now recognized for her intelligence, her political acumen, and her courage to forge a path that defied tradition. Catherine's resilience and unyielding sense of justice are seen not as stubbornness, but as principled resistance. They are no longer flat characters in a morality play but complex figures whose motivations, missteps, and triumphs deserve equal scrutiny and respect. What makes their story enduring is not simply the enormity of what they set into motion, but how relatable their struggles remain. Even as queens, they were not immune to the societal expectations placed upon women, to be beautiful, fertile, obedient, and supportive. When they stepped beyond those confines, Catherine, by refusing to surrender her status, and by demanding marriage and influencing policy, they paid the price. Their stories underscore the thin line between admiration and suspicion that powerful women have always had to walk. And yet, despite their personal defeats, they triumphed in ways they could never have foreseen. Through Mary and Elizabeth, both women achieved the ultimate legacy, the crown. They mothered queens who would shape the future of England in profound ways. They redefined what it meant to rule as a woman in a world built for kings. And through their suffering, they exposed the human costs of monarchy, not just for themselves, but for the many who would follow in their path. The story of Catherine and Anne ends not with one victorious over the other, but with both lost to the very power they had sought or defended. Yet that loss birthed transformation. They changed not only the role of queenship but the very structures of church and state. Their rivalry is more than a footnote in Tudor history, it is the beating heart of its most transformative era. In losing everything, they gave birth to a new England. And that, perhaps, is the ultimate paradox, that in their rivalry, their suffering, and their downfall, they found a kind of immortality that power alone could never secure.